Hello everyone. Let's take a look at the Twin Consorts fight in the Throne of Thunder. This is the penultimate boss of the instance, not counting the heroic-only boss. During the fight, you will face two bosses, Lu Lin and Suen. While they are twins, they do not share health pool, and in fact, which of them you end up killing first affects the course of the fight. We're going to talk a bit about the structure of the fight before we look at abilities. The fight begins with the Darkness phase, during which you will be fighting Lu Lin, who uses several abilities. At certain points in this phase, Suen will briefly appear and damage you, but she doesn't really participate in the fight. The Darkness phase lasts 3 minutes, after which time you enter a Daylight phase. During the Daylight phase, you will fight Suen, who now uses several abilities. During this phase, Lu Lin will appear from time to time and cast an ability, but just like Suen in the Darkness phase, she is not really a concern. The Daylight phase also lasts precisely 3 minutes, after which point you enter the Break of Dusk phase. We did not get to this phase on the PTR, and few other raids did, none of them having killed the boss to our knowledge. During the Break of Dusk phase, you must fight both of the bosses at the same time. They each retain some of their abilities from the previous phases, and Lu Lin also gains a few new ones. This phase ends when one of the two bosses is killed. Depending on which boss you kill, you will once again enter either the Darkness or the Daylight phase. Specifically, if you kill Lu Lin, you will enter the Daylight phase, and if you kill Suen, you will enter the Darkness phase. We assume that the Break of Dusk phase has no time limit and, as we said, ends when one of the two bosses is killed. Additionally, we believe that once you do kill a boss and enter a Darkness or Daylight phase, you will remain in that phase until the end of the fight. These are details that we will iron out by the time we release our proper guide for this boss. Now, let's see what the bosses actually do. During the Darkness phase, Lu Lin uses 3 abilities. Cosmic Barrage causes Lu Lin to place a number of stars on the floor of the room. A few seconds later, each star chooses a random raid member and effectively charges them, dealing damage to them and anyone else within an 8-yard radius. The blue lines that you see on the screen indicate which raid member each star charges. Just treat this ability as unavoidable raid damage for which you need to be spread out. Moon Lotus spawns a flower at a random location in the room. Green clouds emanate from this flower in random directions, moving slowly through the raid. If you come into contact with a cloud, you are put to sleep for 5 seconds, essentially being stunned. You just need to avoid getting touched by these clouds. Beast of Nightmares spawns an ad that fixates on one of the tanks and damages them. Only the tank on which the ad is fixated can damage and kill it. While the tank is fixated upon, any healing done to them will cause the healer or healers to gain stacks of a damaging dot called Corrupted Healing. Ideally, the tank will take as little damage as possible and kill the ad as quickly as possible. On the PTR, Corrupted Healing was triggered for all ticks of HOTS as well as by all smart heals, meaning that the ability was very hard to handle, but this will probably be changed in the live version. Suen casts 2 abilities during this phase. One is called Tears of the Sun, which is a channeled ability that deals damage to random raid members. The other ability is called Light of Day, which targets a random raid member with a beam of light, dealing damage in an 8-yard area around the target. As we mentioned, Suen only appears briefly during this phase, and if you are already spread out, as you should be for Cosmic Barrage, her abilities will only mean increased raid damage. During the Daylight phase, Suen uses several abilities. Fan of Flames is a stacking tank debuff, which increases fire damage taken and which prompts a tank switch. Flames of Passion causes Suen to charge a random raid member and then run back to her tank. When she charges, she leaves behind a trail of fire on the ground which must be avoided. Now, this is where things get a bit more complicated. Throughout the phase, Suen gains a stacking buff called Blazing Radiance, which increases her damage dealt. The only way to get rid of these stacks is by bringing Suen close to objects called Ice Comets. Ice Comets are created by Lu Lin randomly during this phase. It is the only thing that Lu Lin does in the Daylight phase. Lu Lin targets random raid members, and the comet lands on that location a few seconds later, dealing damage in a 6-yard area. The comet remains on the ground as an attackable NPC, as you can see here. So, to reiterate, keeping Suen close to an ice comet causes her to lose stacks of her buff. Unfortunately, she also melts the comet when she is close to it, eventually causing it to disappear. This means that Suen needs to be moved to a new comet each time the current one disappears. Finally, Suen also casts Light of Day during this phase, the same ability she uses during the Darkness phase. It deals damage to a random raid member and to anyone who is within 8 yards of them. This proximity damage also affects the ice comets, causing them to melt, so no one, except the tank who is tanking Suen, should be close to the comet. There is an additional mechanic during this phase, but this either was not working well on the PTR or we merely failed to use it properly. Supposedly, whenever light is shown at the comet, presumably by having Suen close to it, the comet casts a shadow, and anyone standing inside the shadow takes 80% reduced fire damage. We found, however, that standing in this shadow caused the comet to disappear very quickly due to the proximity damage of Light of Day melting it. So we are unsure of how exactly this is supposed to work. The comet can be attacked and damaged by the raid, but we found no reason to do this, and it only seems to hurt your cause. Finally, during the Break of Dusk phase, you will have to fight both bosses at once. As we mentioned, we did not get to this phase, so what we say next is mostly conjecture based on the dungeon journal and the experiences of some raids who reached the phase. The first thing to keep in mind is that you need to tank them more than 10 yards apart, since otherwise Lulin will heal Suen. Lulin continues to spawn comets during this phase, and she casts a new ability called Tidal Force. When casting Tidal Force, Lulin stands still channeling and shoots waves of water in many directions. These waves can be avoided, although not easily. During this time, she is practically immune to damage. Suen does not seem to gain any new abilities. The wording of the dungeon journal implies that Suen will not gain stacks of blazing radiance during this phase, but on the PTR she was certainly gaining them. In any case, if she does gain these stacks, you should continue to remove them using the comets that Lulin spawns. Suen also continues to charge players during this phase. We are unsure whether or not she continues to cast Fan of Flames and Light of Day. As we mentioned, once one of the two bosses is killed, you will enter the phase that is associated with the remaining boss. Given the fact that Lulin is immune at various times during the Break of Dusk phase, you will probably end up killing Suen first. This will leave you in a final Darkness phase, which should prove to be fairly uneventful. In case that you kill Lulin first, we imagine that there will be no way to remove Suen's stacks of blazing radiance, since Lulin is no longer there to create comets, which will cause the fight to gain a soft and rage component. This is further supported by the achievement for the fight, which requires you to kill Lulin first, while Suen is still above 30% health, which appears to be setting you up for a difficult final phase. There is one more aspect of the fight that we need to talk about. You may have noticed some cranes and a giant ox appearing on the screen at certain points. These are manifestations of the four Celestials, Niu Zhao, Qi, Yulon, and Xuen. You can summon their help during the fight. A member of your raid needs to activate the desired Celestial by performing a quite interesting task. Around the edges of the room, there are 4 pillars, each corresponding to one of the 4 Celestials. When a player clicks a pillar, they are teleported into another room. In there, they are presented with a pattern which shows up above their character's head, and they must recreate the pattern by connecting the stars on the floor of the room with their character. Right now, you can see what activating Yulon is like. First, you click the pillar. Then you enter the room. Upon doing so, you are presented with the pattern. In this case, it is the letter W. Then you must simply trace this letter on the floor using your character as the pen. Once the pattern is complete, you are teleported out. The 4 buffs provided are as follows. Niu Zhao increases the maximum health of all raid members for 15 seconds. Qi attacks your enemies several times, dealing 5 million damage per hit. Yulon regenerates your raid's health and mana for 15 seconds. Xuen slows down time, causing all boss abilities and mechanics to be performed much slower, while your raid remains unaffected. This is supposed to allow you to avoid some abilities that were previously unavoidable. We imagine that it refers mainly to the Flames of Passion and the landing of the Ice Comet, but other abilities may also be affected by this. We are not certain whether or not the buffs provided by the Celestials are reusable or whether they can only be used once per fight, but we do know that you can use all 4 Celestials during the same encounter. Ideal ways of using the buffs will probably emerge over time, but for now we can make the following broad suggestions. Qi should probably be used during the Break of Dusk phase, which appear to be the most difficult, so that you can quickly kill one of the 2 bosses and leave that phase. All other Celestials are probably best used during the daylight and break of dusk phases. We say this because, frankly, the darkness phase felt like the easiest one, and you shouldn't really need any external help to get through it. We're going to be releasing a detailed written and video guide of this boss closer to patch 5.2. Thank you for watching, we hope you enjoyed this preview and remember to subscribe.